Hello, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2021 Albert H. Gordon Lecture. Albert Gordon, who lived until the remarkable age of 107, was an eminence grise of the investment community. He helped pick up the pieces of a shattered Keter Peabody after the 1929 Wall Street crash, then built the firm into what Forbes magazine has called a powerhouse on Wall Street. At his death in 2009, Gordon was also the oldest graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Business School, having graduated from the college in 1923 and from the business school in 1925. A true Harvard citizen, Gordon was a past president of the Harvard Club of New York. His generosity towards Harvard is evident in the Albert H. Gordon Track and Tennis Center, as well as the Albert H. Gordon Professorship of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. In 1985, Gordon established a fund to sponsor an annual Albert H. Gordon Lecture Series in the field of finance and public policy, with special attention to the internationalization of finance. So I'm very delighted that this year we have Tharman to address us and give the Gordon Lecture for this year. Tharman doesn't need much introduction. He is a senior minister currently in Singapore, having served for several years as Deputy Prime Minister, and then previously as Finance Minister and previously as Education Minister. He is also currently the Coordinating Minister for Social Policies and advises the Prime Minister of Singapore on economic policies. He chairs the National Jobs Council, which aims at building skills and jobs in the wake of COVID-19. He's at the same time the chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is Singapore's central bank, as well as financial regulator. Internationally, he is involved in a large number of bodies and groups, and he's the chairman of the Group of 30, a group of distinguished practitioners and thinkers on the international economic system. Tharman received his MPA at the Harvard Kennedy School in 1989. I was at the time a young, inexperienced assistant professor, and I'm happy to say he was in my class. I think it's probably one of the things that I'm proud of is that he seems to have survived the experience without much great visible damage. If there is ever was a Renaissance man of public policy, I think Tharman would be it. There's virtually no area of public policy in which he does not have significant experience and on which he has not thought deeply and has extremely deep and synthetic contributions to make. I've heard him speak many, many times, and each one of them was a revelation. So I think we are in for another treat. I'm going to turn it over to Tharman.
Thanks very much, Dani. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be back at the Kennedy School after so many years, almost 40 years, and a double pleasure because I did actually have a brilliant assistant professor as my teacher when I was there. And I have since followed his thinking and his work very closely. And I do regard Dani as one of the most important thinkers of our time on both the issues of domestic, social and economic compacts, as well as the issues of international cooperation and how we rebuild and repair the current multilateral system. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here. Let me start by saying that we are seeing a shift in the zeitgeist. We are seeing a shift in public beliefs. It wasn't brought about by COVID, but it has been accelerated by COVID. First, we're seeing a return of the state. and a return in public belief in the importance of public investment. But it's so far been a narrative and a set of policies that are largely focused on the crisis itself, on managing the crisis. And quite obviously, vaccination, testing, tracing, everything to do with managing the pandemic has required a very strong hand of the state. And it's also been about the large budgetary and central bank bazookas, which were also necessary in the crisis. But we haven't actually had very deep thinking on the future ambition of the state, not just about size, but about role, about aspiration, and about how the state has to be an activist in new ways. We haven't had very much thinking about that. And we really have to think of the future as we come out of COVID. While we're in COVID as well as we come out of COVID, how do we address the long-standing and fundamental social and economic challenges that we see all over the world? The wearing thin of social compacts, the risk of secular stagnation, certainly in the advanced economies, and fundamentally the need to rebuild optimism. We have to address those issues fundamentally and position the state, an activist state, in ways that it can tackle those challenges. So that's the first shift in the zeitgeist, the return of the state, but it hasn't gone very far. The second shift has been in the recognition by force of the crisis, the recognition that collective action globally is in everyone's interests. The pandemic brought that home. Climate change is bringing that home, and particularly ground up. Populations are now much more alert to the risks and the threats of climate change, and the fact that it's in everyone's interest that we address it with some urgency. But again, this shift in the zeitgeist has not been accompanied by very strong or real commitments on these issues, and I'll come back to that later. So what are the real collective actions required, both within nations on the part of the state and the state working with its social partners, as well as internationally? I think we have to address the two big divergences, the social divergences within nations, as well as the divergences between nations, and in particular, the fact that we are seeing a faltering of the process of convergence by which developing countries gradually ascended and caught up with the developed world. That process has faltered for a while now, and it's at very real risk of being rolled back. That divergence we're seeing internationally is a very serious threat, not just to the developing world, but to everyone. So those two big divergences have to be addressed. But we also have to invest. We have to invest in the global commons through both national actions as well as the building of global capacity. And if we fail to do so, we will face much larger costs of dealing with that failure. Much larger costs, as we're seeing in the pandemic, where the costs of dealing with the pandemic are vastly larger, multiples larger than the costs of having invested in the global commons to prevent pandemics and to better manage their spread when an outbreak occurs. Let me divide up the rest of my talk into three parts. First, I'll talk about the advanced economies, then about the developing economies, addressing the issues of the role of the state as well as the role of constructive multilateralism. And I'll finally end up by talking briefly about the global commons. And I'll have to be quite sketchy in the way I lay out the issues, but I'll be very happy to discuss, to have a discussion after my talk. The advanced economies. At risk of some simplification, I would say the fundamental challenges and solutions are domestic. They don't actually have very much to do with globalization and the challenges and competition posed by globalization. And I'm not going to go into the wealth of studies on this matter, which are still ongoing. But to put it very simply, if you look at advanced economies with roughly the same degree of openness to trade and investment, and openness to technological changes that come from outside, you find quite a wide variance of outcomes. The Nordic economies, Korea, Singapore, some others do better than others on the basic indicators of inclusive growth. If you look at median income growth, if you look at the spread of incomes, if you look at various other indicators, there's a wide variance amongst relatively advanced economies who are all equally open. And in fact, some of the better performing countries tend to be more open than the others. So I would say the fundamental issues are domestic, and the key differentiator between countries is in fact in domestic policy responses to technological change and to globalization. And it's that domestic response that we have to focus on as we go forward. What ambition for the state? What should be the ambition for the state as we go forward in this set of relatively advanced countries? What type of activism, besides talking about the size of budget deficits and about how long QE or central bank accommodative monetary policy should continue for? The real issue is what type of activism on the part of the state is going to address the fundamental economic and social challenges of the day. And I think first we have to think of it not in downstream actions, social insurance, mitigating market outcomes, particularly mitigating inequalities, all that is necessary. But that's the downstream actions. They don't necessarily breed optimism in the future. We've got to invest upstream. We've got to invest in the wellsprings of broad-based prosperity and the wellsprings of economic dignity, broadly shared. It can't be left to the natural workings of the market or the natural workings of society to determine how people shape up in life, and then the state picks up the pieces and attempts some redistribution. That's morally the wrong solution, and it's also a very inefficient solution. We have to focus on equalizing opportunities early in life, building social scaffoldings through life to help those who start with less, and ensure that the broad middle in our societies also feels a sense of a journey that they're taking that uplifts them. It's not just about the extremes of the distribution, it's about the broad middle, very importantly. So I would say there are three key strategies we have to focus on. First, social mobility. That's at the core of the sense of unease that's gnawing many societies. The fact that you now have a frozen stacking of people. It requires more than small bore interventions. It requires a very determined effort by the state working with its social partners from early in life, as well as through the growing years into the early part of people's careers, and providing multiple opportunities through life for people to pick up new skills, uplift themselves. Remember, it's not just an issue of relative mobility, which is of course extremely important, making sure society is fluid, but we need a moving escalator. People must feel that absolute mobility wherever they're standing on the escalator. And that requires not just social strategy, that requires economic strategy as well, which is the second key priority. We need to redress the slowdown and in fact close to non-existent productivity growth in a whole range of advanced economies that has been with us for a while. We need to defy the threat of secular stagnation that is already there in front of us. And we need to create a broad distribution of good jobs. And this requires economic strategy fundamentally, but it also requires a compact between social partners to be able to spread good jobs more broadly, to be able to spread productivity and innovations across a span of firms in an industry, because that lack of diffusion of innovation has been at the heart of weak productivity growth. There's some outstanding innovative firms near the frontiers of each industry, but there's been increasing concentration of growth amongst a few leaders and very little diffusion of innovation to the rest. And that requires a new dirigism. It requires a new role for the state, not the old state-directed or state-owned strategies, which waned a long time ago. But you need a new role for the state as a coordinator, as a catalyst, and as a co-developer of collective capacity. And we can come back to that later, but it involves sharing the risks of R&D. It involves creating a social ecosystem for collective learning, importantly, through the workforce, not just those who are knowledge-based professionals, but ordinary blue-collar workers, ordinary white-collar workers, being able to learn continuously through life in a way that's convenient, that's subsidized, and that involves not just the state working with individuals, but employers playing a key role. Employers playing a key role because they know that if they invest in their people, and if everyone invests in their people, what goes around comes around. And we've got to create that type of social compact. So that's the second basic challenge. The first I spoke about was social mobility. The second is tackling secular stagnation and creating a broad distribution of good jobs. The third challenge, which is a neglected area in economic and social policy, is helping people and towns and regions that have lost out because of economic disruptions to bounce back. Bouncing back is a greatly neglected field of economic and social policy, and we've got to give it much greater emphasis. And again, we have strategies for doing so, but it involves the state working with social partners at both a federal and local level, and there are examples of how it's been done better in some parts of the world than others. Moving to the developing countries, I think this is a key arena for cooperative internationalism. We are at a very serious risk of seeing a good part of the emerging world now become a submerging world. And we are at a very serious risk amongst low-income countries of seeing a set of problems that are not merely going to be economic, but are going to multiply and will show themselves up around the world. Communicable diseases, forced migration, terrorism, a whole set of factors. We ignore this issue. If we ignore this issue, we're at profound danger. The developing world requires investment, it requires collective action, and it's actually a global public good. Getting the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, to do well is a global public good. It's a race between technology and demography. The technologies are evolving. They're becoming, in manufacturing especially, and in some other areas, they're becoming less manpower intensive, much more skill intensive. It's also less manpower intensive. So the job creating capacity of new industries is less than what it used to be. But the demography is one where you have a large bulge of a youthful population, particularly in Africa and South Asia, India, Pakistan, South Asia, a bulge that's much larger than what happened when China entered the global workforce. It's a much larger youthful bulge, and we have to create jobs for them. So it's this race between technology and demography that we have to address. But there still is a window, a finite window, but there still is a window for job creation and getting people on a ladder of skills that can take them up over time, a ladder of skills and incomes. It's not too late. 3 strategies. First, education and human capital development. I don't need to elaborate, but it's the biggest inequality in the world. If you just think very simply of kids aged 10 to 14, in North America, about 8% of them are deemed to be not achieving the basic proficiency in reading and numeracy that you need at that age. About 8%, maybe let's say 10%. In Latin America, it's about 51%. In South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa, it's about 59%. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it is 85%. It's the biggest inequality that we have in the world, and it'll have consequences for a generation to come. We have to address it with urgency, and it requires determined action nationally, regionally, and multilaterally. And we have to address in particular the criminal neglect of girls' education, because each of those figures I gave you are much higher when you look at girls, particularly girls in secondary school. It's a huge issue for the future. And it's an issue of gender inequality on a much larger scale than people realize. There are fragmented efforts right now. There are initiatives underway by UNESCO, the Global Education Forum, which I happen to co-chair with Gordon Brown and Gracia Marshall and others. But there's a lot of work ahead. Second strategy that's critical. We've got to seize the window for outward-oriented industrial growth. And I do believe that window still exists. Fortunately, we haven't seen that much retrenchment of global supply chains coming out of COVID. There was a temporary halt, but the supply chains are still very much there. There's a little more diversification of supply chains, much better risk management, but global supply chains are still very much alive. First opportunity is China. China's wages are moving up quite significantly, and China is now focusing on developing its domestic markets. So both from a demand perspective, as well as a supply perspective, that there's scope for labor-intensive production to be decanted out of China, and for Chinese investors themselves to be investing in the developing world. I think there's an opportunity, there's a window for Africa and South Asia to get onto this ladder of skills and incomes that comes out of labor-intensive manufacturing and other related activities. I won't get into all the details, but there's a third reason why I feel there's still scope for optimism here, and that is regionalization or regional integration. There's a huge opportunity in Africa for regional integration. Implementation is key, and there's a need to invest in the first instance on regional public goods. Every form of regional public good is lacking: transport corridors, digital connectivity, regional electricity grids. A whole set of regional public goods are lacking. That's an opportunity now, and it requires multilateral action as well as coordination amongst the states in Africa. But I believe there's this opportunity. And remember, Africa has tremendous agri-export potential. It has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. Climate change will put some of it at risk, but 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, and it's got 1/3 of the world's remaining mineral resources. Tremendous scope using regionalization to build up economies of scale in supply chains for export to the world. So it's not an argument about just demand. In other words, creating a regional market that provides more demand. It's also a supply side argument, creating competitive supply chains for export to the world. That's the second strategy I was talking about, seizing the window for outward-oriented industrialization while it still exists. Third, very important point is we need vastly greater funding for investments in the developing world. It was far short of required before COVID. It's now a much larger gap because of COVID. And we have to take it very seriously because every form of finance has to be enhanced: official finance, private finance, multilateral finance. And we have to organize development finance very differently from the past. And we have to fix some things in the international monetary system to expose countries less to the volatility of capital flows that they are often facing. We have to allow capital to flow downhill, as economists put it. In other words, from the advanced world to the developing world. Whereas in the last 20 years, on a net basis, capital has actually flowed from the developing world to the advanced world. It's the wrong way around. The developing world has to run current account deficits with investments greater than savings in order to grow. But it's not been possible to run those current account deficits because you don't have the net flow of capital to finance those deficits. It's very different from Korea. Large deficits for several years, 5 to 7% of GDP, Now, if a developing country tries to run a deficit of more than 2% of GDP, it gets punished by the markets. So we have to tackle this. And I'm not going to elaborate now, but there are ways in which we can reorganize multilateral finance to multiply the finance available by crowding in private investors. And very importantly, focusing not just on borrowings, focusing not just on getting more debt into the system, because these are already relatively indebted countries. We need a lot more equity investment. And when you think of equity investment, we have to focus fundamentally on risk. We have to de-risk the investment environment, de-risk individual projects, and we have to diversify risk by pooling projects and pooling investments in different countries into new synthetic instruments. There are many details in this, but they're not awfully complicated. It can be done. We just have to reorganize global development finance. But I want to touch on one more point, which is very important, which has to do with the international monetary system. Capital flow volatility is a problem. Each time you get a sudden stop in capital, each time you get capital withdrawing quickly from a country for reasons that are international, some small change in the interest rates in the United States or some of the other major centers, but it's principally the US monetary policy that determines the global financial cycle and risk on and risk off perceptions amongst international investors. Each time that happens, you're setting back growth. You're forcing domestic policies, monetary policies, and fiscal policies to be tighter than they need to be, and you're setting back growth. So we've got to find a way in which you have a more stable and resilient finance into the developing world. But you also need a stronger global financial safety net, because the reality of a global financial system is that there still will be volatility. We're not going to completely reform the system in the next 10 years. Volatility is a fact, but it can be addressed through a more resilient and predictable global financial system. The alternative, if you don't have it, and here I'm talking about things where the solutions are known, SDR allocations, quick responding, liquidity lines to developing countries. There's no lack of ideas as to how to do it. And the IMF has begun to do it, but on a scale that's still too small. But if we don't have a resilient global financial safety net, countries will either have to resort to domestic capital controls or some forms of capital flow management, or they'll have to build up insurance for themselves by building up reserves, which means you're going to run current account surpluses, and that comes at the expense of your growth if you're a developing country. Both those are not good for growth in those countries and not good for growth globally. So if you're someone who believes in free markets and you believe in the free flow of capital in order to spur growth, you cannot dislike all these three things. You can't dislike capital controls, dislike countries building up reserves, and dislike global financial safety nets. You can only dislike two of them. You can't dislike all three. It's a trilemma. If you dislike capital controls because of what they hamper growth in many ways, they create uncertainty. If you dislike countries building up their own reserves, which are not a good idea if you're a developing country, then you have to have a global financial safety net to allow them to deal with the shocks of global capital flows. And that reality of a second best world has to be accepted. It can be organized. It's not very expensive for the wealthier countries, and we've got to get it in place. Final point about investing in the developing world. Think hard about taxes. We have to tackle tax evasion, corruption, and other forms of leakage. They're still very large in a good part of the developing world. That's a fundamental strategy. And it has been a multilateral achievement that we have through the BEPS process, as it's called, base erosion profit shifting. We've really achieved something to tackle profit shifting by multinationals, booking profits in different places based on where the taxes are lower, not based on where the economic activity is conducted, but based on where taxes are lower. They simply shift profits around. They can use transfer pricing, for instance. We've got to tackle harmful preferential tax regimes. We've got to tackle the problem of the true tax havens. But that was the work of BEPS. that was going very well and still going very well. But the new discussions taking place involve more than that. They involve setting a minimum effective corporate tax rate everywhere. And I think we have to think very hard about its implications, not just for global competition, but for the developing world in particular, for small countries and for developing countries. Ghana in 2019 introduced, I'm just using an example, Ghana in 2019 introduced a 10-year tax break for global automobile manufacturers to come and assemble cars in Ghana, to create jobs, develop the skills, develop the capabilities. And it's working. Volkswagen, Nissan, and others have been going to Ghana. Now, if you don't allow developing countries to compete properly on the basis of tax, based on real economic activity, not just booking of profits, real economic activity, then how do they compete? By keeping wages as low as possible? By having terms for labor that are not the most humane? How do they compete? Tax competition has not been an evil. The evil is tax evasion and tax havens in the true sense. So let's think very hard about this. Think about this from a global perspective and not just the perspective of the large developed countries who will stand most to gain by having a minimum effective corporate tax rate. The global commons, finally. We can discuss it further, but it is oddly the most neglected area of global cooperation. Despite it being so obviously and evidently in the interests of all nations to invest and cooperate to bolster the global commons. Whichever area you look at in the global commons, health, which is what we are beset with now, the oceans, biodiversity, the climate crisis, and they're all connected as we know. Whichever area you look at, the basic issue is each of these areas has a well-established scientific tipping point beyond which you get irreversible damage for humanity and in fact for life on Earth. And whichever of these areas you look at, that tipping point is already very close at hand. In some areas, we've gone beyond. So it's a matter of urgent action, urgent collective action, that we address the need to invest in the global commons and avoid further damage from taking place. And the costs of doing so, which is the third point about the global commons, the costs of doing so are actually modest compared to the costs of not doing so, as we're learning from the pandemic. And the costs of doing so are also modest relative to the benefits of doing so. More green jobs created, replenishing of fishing stocks, and so on and so forth. So we have to take the global commons much more seriously. It's one of the greatest weaknesses in international cooperation. That's something that's not actually hugely expensive for nations to collaborate on, and is evidently in all nations' interests, is in fact the most neglected. The pandemic, I can discuss it further because Larry Summers, myself, and Ngozi are co-chairing a newly set up G20 panel to strengthen the whole system going forward of financing, prevention, surveillance, preparedness, and response to pandemics. COVID-19 is not the last pandemic we'll face, nor may it even be the most serious pandemic we're going to face. And we are unprepared. We were unprepared this time. It was a collective failure internationally. And that's why the cost has been so large, not just financially, but the cost to human lives. And we've got to avoid it happening again. There are collective action problems, as the economists would put it, that have hampered collaboration, but they can be addressed. And we have to take this very, very seriously. So the G20 panel that we've just established is going to come up with a set of proposals for a more resilient and more proactive system of financing for pandemics, focused especially on prevention and not just responding after a pandemic has broken out. So I'll stop there, but I just want to end up by saying that coming back to the broad theme of that coupling of cooperative internationalism and domestic inclusivity, policies for domestic inclusivity, they have to go together. Without an open global order, without cooperative internationalism, constructive multilateralism, we will see weaker growth, weaker opportunities for job creation, weaker opportunities for the middle of society to move up. in every country, including the advanced world. But until we tackle the issues that are besetting countries themselves, particularly in the advanced economies, advanced societies, the growing social and political polarization, the fact that you've got a hollowing out of the middle in workforces, until we tackle the basic fault lines domestically, it's going to be very hard for us to achieve a renewed sense of solidarity internationally. So we have to do both things together. I'll stop there, Dani.
Thank you, Tharman, so much. This was incredibly comprehensive. You've given us so much to think about. I love your trilemma of the global financial system, that among capital controls, reserve buildups, and global safety nets, you can have it. You have to have you cannot have all three. You have to give up on at least one of those three. So that's just fantastic. You've talked about a shift towards the state. You mentioned, in fact, in new dirigism, and in many of the areas, particularly in the advanced countries, the agenda you laid out really involved a much more action on the part of the state. Now, somebody listening in the audience to you might say, "Oh, it's easy for Tharman to talk about more state intervention. He's coming from Singapore, where these things do happen, but the rest of the world, the state is not nearly as effective." Can you talk a little bit about sort of what you have learned? I mean, Singapore was not always a country where the public sector was particularly effective, and that had to be built. Can you tell us a little bit about what you have learned and what we can take in the rest of the world about how you build effective state capacity so that we can think of actually doing those things?
Right, thanks. Well, so as I mentioned, we should think of it in terms of the role of the state as coordinator and as catalyst. That's the new dirigism, and it requires a spirit of activism on the part of the state. What we have learned is what we've learned from the rest of the world, and I'll go through a few key elements there. First, public sector sharing of risk in R&D has to be part of the menu. It has to be there. And the chief example of how it's been done successfully over time was in the United States. And the examples of what DARPA did and other major initiatives, but the public sector was critical to R&D innovation in the US. It was critical to Apollo. It was critical to a whole set of major technological breakthroughs that launched Silicon Valley as well. So that's important. And last year, I mean, the one silver lining coming out of last year was the speed with which vaccines were developed and manufactured. And Operation Warp Speed on the manufacturing side, but also the R&D that led to the vaccines being developed was very impressive, but it was a public-private collaboration. Second, we've all learned something about the need to have cluster-based strategies, or to exploit the economics of agglomeration, as economists would put it. There is something to, but it requires a very active collaboration between leading companies, spin-offs, small companies, either in a particular location or in a particular industry and supply chain, where they can collaborate on where they have a common interest. And what they usually have a common interest in is first, the pre-competitive R&D. That's where the public sector has to get involved as well. And there's a lot of space for collaboration in pre-competitive R&D, even when it's at the translational stage, before it actually becomes commercializable. Second, a huge issue, which is not just about the companies, but about workforces, is about that constant upskilling of your workforce. And there are models of how this is done. We happen to be quite organized about the way we're going about it in Singapore. And one of our most important social and economic strategies is what we call Skills Future, learning by the entire workforce on a continuous basis through life. The Northern Europeans were the furthest advanced. But I think we sometimes tend to focus too much on apprenticeship type schemes. Early in people's, straight after you leave school, in that case, it's after age 15 or early in one's career. What's really required for the future is a flexible and open system through life. And actually, there's some parts of the United States at a local level where it's working quite well. In fact, it's a more flexible and open system than you see in Northern Europe. So you need that flexibility and openness and that agility of the system as you go forward. It cannot be done without the public sector. It requires subsidy, it requires coordination, but it requires industry leaders to take the high road of investing in their people, but also being willing to invest in industry reskilling capacity. And that culture is strongest in Northern Europe, I would say. The Germans, the Swiss, the Austrians, the Nordics. That culture is not something that we have or the Americans have. It came out of 800 years of history, in fact. But we have to develop those social compacts in our own way, because they're ultimately social compacts between employers, unions, other social partners, educational institutions, and government. And it has to be developed. Third, I would say, very importantly, is public goods require re-emphasis. Everything from investing in widely accessible and cheap broadband, investing in that subsidized infrastructure for lifelong learning that I was talking about. Public goods are critical to broad-based social well-being. And we've got to invest in that. We can't just invest in mitigating outcomes in the market. We've got to invest in public goods that everyone feels they're benefiting from, and particularly the broad middle feels that they're benefiting from. And we have lost sight of public goods for some time. Public finance used to be principally about public goods, and we've lost sight of public goods for a while. So I would just highlight those few things. Public sector risk sharing in R&D, which is a basis for future productivity growth, diffusing productivity growth more widely through cluster-based strategies, upskilling workforces through not just individual firm actions, but collaboration within industries and supply chains. And fourthly, investing in public goods, everything from quality public school systems or preschool systems and public school systems through to broadband and through to lifelong learning. And these are lessons we've been learning from everywhere in the world.
Yeah. So you laid out quite an agenda for developing countries as well, in terms of seizing the remaining window of opportunity for plugging into global value chains and fostering export-oriented industrialization, improved and greater investment in education, figure out ways of accessing international capital markets and global development finance in a better way. And you emphasize at the outset that I think that COVID is really endangering the process of convergence that we had been experiencing for the last couple of decades. That Sub-Saharan Africa actually had a pretty good 10, 15 years before the pandemic, and it wasn't just the natural resource exporting countries. It was countries that were sort of beginning to reindustrialize and build up a middle class and so forth. Now, do you think that the pandemic actually changes the agenda for these countries? I mean, it certainly seems like it's going to retard their economic development, and the whole weight of the full set of costs have not been borne yet. The advanced countries, in fact, have been hit quicker and in a bigger way. They've suffered bigger falls of income proportionately. And bigger public health costs, but that it seems like developing countries, particularly low-income countries, it's going to be more of a drawn-out process. Does it change what they need to do? Is it?
Yeah, I think there are 3 points. First is the point that you just made, which is that the full economic and social impact on the developing world, particularly the low-income developing world, has yet to be seen. For reasons that are not fully understood the rate of spread of the virus was less harsh in many developing countries than in the advanced world, but it's left to be seen. And what we are seeing now very dangerously is the emergence of variants or mutation of the virus in the poorest countries, in countries which haven't yet been infected widely, are in fact the breeding site globally for the new variants. So that's the first point. Second, risk premia associated with investment in the low-income developing world, and in fact in developing countries generally, were too high before COVID, and they're now even higher because there's just risk aversion now. There's just global risk aversion. And the ones who lose out the most when you have global risk aversion are the developing world. So that's a very serious issue that has to be tackled, which is why we have to reorganize multilateral finance to reduce risk in the first instance, to find ways of mitigating it through risk pooling. And we've got to find ways of crowding in private finance on a scale that just hasn't been done before. The third point is that we have a very long tail coming out of this crisis when it comes to the developing world, because the rate at which people have dropped out of school has been much larger in the developing world than in the advanced countries. There's been a bit of a zigzag in the advanced countries, but we have very serious consequences coming out of lack of schooling in the developing world. And the consequences of that will be seen for the next 60 years if we don't arrest it soon and with some urgency.
Let's take some questions from our audience. The first question will be posed by Harvard College student Ryan. So we'll invite him to our screen. There you are. Right, go ahead.
Hi, Minister Shanmugaratnam. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Ryan. I'm a senior at Harvard College where I study social studies. I also served as co-chair of the policy program at the Institute of Politics. You talked about the importance of restoring social optimism. My question is, how do you restore, what specific strategies do you recommend to restoring social optimism, particularly among older segments of the population who might have had their livelihoods attached to a job that might have been lost due to automation or globalization? I realize that you talked a little bit about lifelong skills, skills rebuilding, but how do you incentivize private actors to invest in workers even later in life when they might not necessarily be willing to do so themselves? Thank you.
So it's a very good question, Ryan. And by the way, I'm amazed at how perfectly you pronounce my surname just like that. There's no way in which governments can create optimism. They've got to, first of all, be very straightforward in telling people the facts. They've got to respect science in the case of the current pandemic, but they've got to tell people what the problems are and how we're going to go about it. Social mobility is not just something for the young, it's something that affects people who are middle-aged. And if people feel that they're somehow left on their own in the middle of their careers, and no one's actually minding about what the rest of their careers are going to be like, it can be deeply deconsoling. So organizing things so that you always feel that you're part of a social compact. Your employer was interested, a former employer was interested. There's a community college you can go to where there's some cause you can pick up, and there are others like you who are going for the same thing, and the government's interested and is willing to fund it. Social compacts have a way of uplifting the spirit. I think tackling those three things I spoke about, social mobility, ensuring that median people in the broad middle can move up in life, which requires productivity growth and a proper distribution of reward from productivity growth, are still central challenges. And governments haven't focused as much on those issues, which I call the upstream issues, as much as they've been focusing on the downstream mitigation of the outcome of markets. But I'm giving a very short answer to a question that's obviously requires a far more complex response.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tharman. Our next question is from HKS alum Dana.
Great. Have very much enjoyed your remarks today, and really appreciate the focus on these global needs. I'm an MPP alum from the Kennedy School, and my question is, do we have enough global diplomatic infrastructure with the UN, the WHO, and the diplomatic corps and NGOs around the world? Or are we now faced with a situation where we need a new global organization and initiative focused exclusively on addressing these widening global disparities articulated today? As a case in point, our global diplomatic infrastructure and associated forums seemed ill-prepared to launch coordinated solutions to vaccinating vulnerable populations in underdeveloped countries around the world, and rising nationalism seems to have largely dispensed with meaningful willingness to embrace an inclusive global strategy in confronting the health crisis associated with COVID.
So I think, Dana, the short answer is we do not. And there has, in particular, on the part of the largest developed countries, been some drift away from multilateralism. That has meant that you're not training up more people and putting more people to the task, but you've actually been withdrawing support for key multilateral initiatives. I don't think we can expect realistically in the next few years to get a major reconstruction of multilateralism. You can't expect to see something like what we saw after World War II. You can't expect a Marshall Plan to spring up because, as I mentioned earlier, until we sort out the domestic polarization in the most advanced societies, we can't expect such ambition globally. But what we can do is to avoid that continued drift. What we can do is to avoid the weaponization of economic relations. And what we can do is to at least regain a sense of cohesiveness and find ways of organizing multilateralism to achieve better impact. And what we can do is to get more real on the global commons, where every society knows that they're going to benefit from it. I think those are things we can do. So we're not going to reinvent multilateralism and reconstruct it entirely, but there's a lot that we have to do going ahead. And it requires good people, it requires expertise, it requires respecting science. And I think the indications in the new US administration are, on all those counts, very positive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Tharman. I think we have time for two more quick questions. So the next question will come from Harvard College student, Julia.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. Earlier on in your lecture, you talked a little bit about this sort of third point about helping people in like individual towns and regions. And you mentioned that helping them bounce back was often neglected. So I'm curious, why do you think that this sort of stage of helping these towns and individual regions and people bounce back has been a neglected field by either policymakers or economists?
Well, there are a few reasons. First, the old zeitgeist was one of letting markets sort this out. And the idea that creative destruction eventually led to some resolution, new jobs would be created, and you get back to a normal state of affairs and full employment, and you've got to let the markets work. Unfortunately, and particularly in large countries, the creation and the destruction happen in different places. If you don't address the issues in the places where jobs and firms have been disrupted, and whole industries sometimes have disappeared, you get a whole new pathology developing around that. The economists when it comes to individuals, the economists talk about what's called hysteresis. Very fancy term, actually, came from biology or something like that, I think. Dani will know that. Where did the term hysteresis come from? Is it physics? I think it's physics, is it?
I'm not
but
sure.
Anyway,
yeah.
I'll look it up. But anyway, the economists like using terms from the sciences.
You leave it to
But
economists
that apply to
with their own.
That apply to individuals. Individuals tend to lose their skills over time if they stay unemployed. So you tend to get a long-term scar that stays with you. But when it happens to a whole town or whole region, you get a long-term community scar that develops its own dynamic and a sense of despondency. And unless the politics responds proactively to that, towns and regions that are down tend to stay down for a long time. And that was a failure. That was a failure.
I think you're absolutely right, Tharman. I think economists vastly overstated the mobility of people. That people would just sort of leave these depressed regions, and they didn't. And so I think you're absolutely right to emphasize place-based policies. The final question will be posed by Harvard College student Arjun.
Hi, Minister Shanmugaratnam. My name is Arjun Akwe. I'm a first year at the college as well. My question is largely in regards to one point you made about regional integration. And I was wondering whether you could expand a bit on how we should view outside actors like China with its Belt and Road Initiative, who oftentimes offer to help develop some of these networks between countries, but also, again, come in with their own self-interest in mind. And how should countries kind of balance those competing interests of their own development and autonomy from outside actors?
Well, first of all, outside actors, as you put it, are going to be critical to Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America. You need external investment. What's also required is greater transparency on the part of external investors. Transparency, particularly about the terms of loans, and transparency about guarantees that have to be offered by the state and the like. I would say the best studies that have been done so far on the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa suggest that there's been a significant net benefit. Hasn't always worked well, but there's been a very significant net benefit. And when you look at the scale of investment required in the next 5 to 10 years, because of the demographics, and secondly, because of the need for sustainable infrastructure to be put in place. And sustainable infrastructure upfront is a little more expensive, although over a lifetime, it is far cheaper than building the old stuff and then cleaning up later. But the initial expenditure required is a little larger. When you add it all up, the scale of investment required in the developing world is vastly larger than anything that's happened in previous decades. And it's going to require official finance. It's going to require the creative use of official finance to crowd in private finance, but private investors are critical. Be they Chinese, American, European, Singaporean, or wherever they come from, they're critical.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Arjun. Thank you. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the hour. I really want to thank our audience for your participation and questions, but most of all, I want to thank Tharman for giving us a really stimulating and insightful perspective that emphasized not only the scale of the challenges, but also pointed us in the direction of the solutions and for giving us a concrete sense of the possible moving forward. I think it's been great. Thank you so much, Tharman, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.